Good morning, gentlemen. 19 months have elapsed since the battle commenced in Ukraine. That was the time when the Russian army was carrying out massive drills inside Russia, and the world thought that Ukraine would be like a ripe plum and fall into the Russian trap. It didn't happen that way. Basically, it was because of faulty military planning and thinking. The Russians never anticipated that the West would back Ukraine to the hilt. That's one. And secondly, they never thought that the Ukrainians had the will to fight. Thirdly, they miscalculated badly, never used the air power which they should have in the very first instance, and crushed Ukraine. They didn't do it. In fact, they treated it as a limited military engagement, and that is not the way to fight a war. So the net result, gentlemen, actually happened was that the Russians did advance towards Kyiv and Kharkiv, and they reached the boundaries of the city. And there was a time when the American embassies and the other all evacuated Kyiv, thinking that the Russians are going to take over the country. It didn't happen like that. And very soon, the Americans and the others realized that the Russians are going to win that easily. So they were helped Ukraine with weapons, and the Russians had to retreat from these two areas. I think it must have been a bitter pill to swallow for Vladimir Putin, but then he himself had to blame for what happened. He should have studied the American bombing of Iraq and Kosovo. If you remember, in the Kosovo War, the Americans bombed the country for 78 days incessantly, and during the Iraq War, they bombed Iraq for 70 days every day. The idea was to soften up the defenses and make it easier for the infantry to move in. That is the beauty of air power. The Russians had tremendous air power, and they should have utilized it in Ukraine, which they never did. They just moved into Ukraine like they were moving into a drawing room, and they had to retreat from Kharkiv as well as Kyiv, and finally now they moved in the Donbas region. Now that's a region which has got a predominant Russian-speaking population, and the people, they're pretty friendly. If the Russians would like to be with Russia. In fact, Russia had been calling for autonomy of this region for a long time, but the Ukrainians, at the best of the Americans, were not doing it. So they came there and they had some success in the sense they took about 20% of the territory of Ukraine. But now, 19 months down the line, one wonders what's going to happen next. Who is going to give and who's going to be the first person to blink? Let's see. I'll give you an assessment now. Most of the American think tank, other than the ones in the government, have of the view that this conflict in Ukraine was provoked by the Americans. I'll not go into history on this particular thing, but remember that in 1992, Russia had applied to join NATO, and Bill Clinton quietly sidestepped the issue, telling Russia not to worry, they're not going to expand eastwards. But by 1998, he had done precisely that, and Russia was feeling the gag around its mouth. Then they took a very fateful decision, I think in 2014, when the Americans engineered the removal of the pro-Soviet, pro-Russian president of Ukraine who went away, and replaced him with this man who they felt was their own stooge. Stooge, as you know, in the English language, is a yes man, and in the Indian language is called a chamcha. So, and that chamcha was Zelenskyy. I mean, he'd been a stage actor all the time. He had no knowledge of politics or anything like that, but at the same time, he had an inherent dislike of Russia. I do not know how he got that dislike. because he is a man who was born much after the breakup of the end of the Second World War, to be very frank, and yet he wanted to align with the West against Russia. Now, the Americans had a very devious plan, as I've been studying it in detail. The plan was to surround Russia with NATO countries and then put pressure on Russia so that it could break into another 2 or 3 countries. The game was very simple, to face Russia as a political power for all time to come. And Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership had repeatedly been telling the Americans, don't do it. Don't bring Ukraine in, because Ukraine's got a border of 2,300 kilometers with Russia. He said, we can't have NATO on our borders like so close. But the Americans thought they were very clever, and so they continued. And Ukraine had its stooge to help the Americans, and he also played ball with the Americans. And the net result was, in one of the public meetings, he held up an application and showed it to the people that this is a fast-track application to join the EU and NATO. This was like a red rag to a bull, and the Russians were bound to intervene. I think it was an existential crisis for Russia. There's nothing much that could be done, frankly, because this was a conflict provoked by the Americans, but perhaps they wanted it that way. They wanted this conflict. The idea was they thought they would sap Russia economically by putting sanctions on it and taking it out from the world global financial system. And then they thought the Russian economy would collapse, Russia would collapse, and they would sue for peace in Ukraine, and, well, America would have its hegemony over the whole of Europe. But you know the old saying, man proposes, God disposes, but God does not dispose this way. And the Russians fought tenaciously, and one reason was that their economy was not entirely dependent on exports or imports from abroad. Russia was self-reliant as far as oil and gas is concerned, with a good industrial base, and the Russian economy had survived the crisis. Another great help which they got was by an alliance with China. Now, China and Russia have been rivals for a long time, and in 1969, if you remember, they had border clashes, as the Chinese were claiming a lot of Russian territory as part of China. However, the border was settled, and now it's like you scratch my back, I scratch your back. Russians and the Chinese are together, and they constitute a very formidable military bloc. And I think the fault for this would go to the Americans. There's no way about it. They, in fact, literally have driven Moscow into the arms of Beijing. So, gentlemen, coming back to the war, the American dream didn't bear fruit. Joe Biden, who'd been vice president in time of Obama for 8 years, thought it was a good time to get some brownie points on Ukraine. He thought they'd be able to beat the Russians, and Russians sue for peace, and then he would be able to go to the election and face the electorate in 2024 and say, look, I won the Ukraine war, and then win the election. But now as it stands, I think the war has entered a very critical phase. After the initial hesitation of the first few months by the Russians, now it's a no-holds-barred campaign. Russians are using the latest weapons, and they have also said in case they have a threat to their existence, they would use nuclear weapons. Gentlemen, it doesn't take long to start a nuclear war. And I wish the Americans had realized it. And now there's a lot of thinking going on in Western Europe, including NATO and America, that perhaps we have overstepped our brief and we should tone down the battle in Ukraine. So what is going to happen next? Are the Americans going to throw in the towel like they did in Afghanistan and call it off? If they do that, the Americans will have no face to show in the world. And Zelenskyy, in any case, would become a person exiled from Ukraine. They won't like him to come there at all. So America would be looking for wire media. Already they are feeling the pinch of supplying billions of dollars of weapons to Ukraine. I think a few months back, Joe Biden had visited Kyiv and he had, with a broad smile, said, "We will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it gets." Very fine, that's a wonderful sentiment, but that is not the reality. America's economy is sinking also. China is catching up very fast and breathing down their neck. They have a trade deficit of $600 billion with China, and they are not able to entice India into their group to be a member of NATO, which some Americans feel is an essential factor in the world so that India can face up to China along with the Americans. The American game is pretty clear. They don't have the manpower to fight China, and everybody knows that fighting with electronic weapons and all that is okay, but it doesn't give you victory because you need the infantry soldier to hold the ground. And that is where the Americans lack. And they thought they would fill up this gap with the Indian infantry, but Modi hasn't played ball, and he's been a very wise man not to get entangled in the battle against China. China and India are not friends, they're enemies, and they're going to be a different clash. But then we can't be fighting the American battle for the sake of the Americans. And now Ukraine is also the bugbear for America. They really don't know what to do. And there's a growing resentment against the war. It's not only the Democrats who are getting against. The Republicans have always been against it. And Donald Trump, when he was president, he had said if he'd been president, he would have ensured there was no war. Perhaps he's right. Because he was a pragmatist, a man who lived in the about 10 years ahead of his time. He was the man who called even the North Korean dictator Kim Jong for meetings. And during his time, Koreans didn't explode any nuclear device. And his relations with Russia were also on even keel. He had a meeting with Putin as well. He admired Putin. But then he lost the election, and the man who came in is Joe Biden. He's fed on the politics of Obama. And Obama, is a very peculiar thing. He became president of America and claims that he's a Catholic. I don't think so. Basically, he went to a madrasa, that is an Islamic school, in the first few years of his life. His father was a Muslim, and I think he's in Kenya. I don't know whether he's alive or not at the moment. His mother married another Muslim. And so the question is, what is Obama's political thought, his religious belief? The very fact that he is now breathing fire on Narendra Modi, where he feels that the Muslims are being persecuted, and he's also breathing fire against the Israelis and warning them not to attack Gaza, shows his lopsided thinking and the fact that his grounding is that as an Islamic follower. He dare not say it openly because in America, if you say, I'm an Islamic, you're going to lose the election. The Americans don't like Islamics. But that is his inherent belief. I think so. He may be having some belief in Christianity also, I don't say that. But there is a lot which is rubbing off on him of the way he studied in his childhood. So coming back to Ukraine, gentlemen, I have just given you an overall global picture of what's happening. Now the question which people have asked me is, Captain, what do you think is going to happen in Ukraine? I mean, you can't continue fighting for years together like this. I agree. Firstly, let me tell you about Ukraine, that Ukraine is now reaching the end of the tether, the end of the rope. There are many Ukrainians who don't want to fight and they are running away from the battlefield. 20% of their population is floating around Europe as a refugee. Their infrastructure is destroyed and they have to draft women to fight as the men are not available. The casualties which the Ukrainians have suffered are very high. And the only way the war is continuing is because of the assistance being given by the Americans. You see, there was the Hindu god of wealth called Kuber, and we read that even his coffers became empty at one time. So, gentlemen, same thing with Uncle Sam. It's been very flagrant in spending money in wars. In Afghanistan, they spent $3 trillion. That's a lot of money, which could have been used more productively. And now they have spent billions into aid to the Ukrainians, and the net result is zero. Ukraine had launched an offensive, but by my reports and whatever information I have got, that offensive has not succeeded. It's got bogged down. And Vladimir Putin can definitely say that the Ukrainian offensive has been blunted. But this is a cause for worry to America, because they thought that Ukraine with the latest weaponry and motivation and whatever you call it would have put the Russians back across the Donbas region. But other than taking a few villages here and there, they haven't moved anywhere. And by the way, gentlemen, don't try to read what's given in the Times, which is published from New York. It's a totally biased paper. And if you read that, you'll feel that, Ukraine almost won the war, which is actually not the position. The Ukrainian forces are very hard-pressed. They're suffering casualties every day. And now they have drafted women to fight. And some of the women who were captured with Russians, well, I don't say anything about them. The battles are on, gentlemen. And Putin has still not used air power to its fullest extent. Though Ukraine has been offered weapons like the F-16 and all that, but they're not going to win them the war. They might prolong it for a little more time, but it's a matter of time that Ukraine front will collapse. And America is looking for a way out. I think at the moment the Americans are looking for a way out. And the way out is only one, the realization that, have a ceasefire, and whatever territory is with the Russians is going to remain with the Russians. They're never going to come back to Ukraine. But if Biden thinks of continuing the war, he's got to worry about what's happening in the Middle East. It's a powder keg, which will blow up any time. And it is worse than what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine, gentlemen, has literally got no future now. If you look at it historically, it was never an independent country of any importance. It was earlier part of the Tsarist Empire, and then it was part of the USSR, the earlier state, the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. But then after Gorbachev, helped break up the Soviet Union, they voted for independence, and they were good friends till 2014 when the Americans started their game and brought in the stooge, Zelenskyy, and so the war has begun. Gentlemen, the situation is very grim at the moment. Ukraine is not having any income at all other than war, and it is relying totally on the weapons being supplied by the West, NATO and America. But then, if weapons were the only things which could win you a war, then so many armies which are so sophisticated in weaponry would have won the battle straight away. It doesn't happen like that. So, Ukraine is in serious problem. They aren't winning. They're not going to win either. And in case tomorrow the Russians mount another offensive and the Americans feel, the time has come that we might as well pull back and look for peace, I think Zelenskyy will have no option but to run away from Ukraine. To my way of thinking, the only way this war can end is if the present occupation which the Russians have under their control is legalized as part of Russia, number one. Number two, Ukraine is not made a member of NATO. Now, these are very tall claims, and I don't think the Ukrainian leadership led by Zelenskyy is going to agree to it. So in that case, the war would just continue, till such time as the Ukrainians are defeated, which is also a distinct possibility. At the moment, it doesn't look likely, but in case America pulls its hands back, says no more weapons, we want to conserve our dollars, because the American public is restive, everybody knows now what's happening, nobody wants the war to continue, and they should be paying the taxes to fight a fruitless war in Ukraine. And maybe the change in thinking has come with the Hamas attack on Israel in the Middle East. The Americans now know they'll have to fight Hamas and the Islamist terrorists in the Middle East, led by Iran, and that's not so easy a task. So the American resources are going to be diverted. I don't think the Americans can fight at two places. Their economy will suffer, and I think they would like to have a detente or a peace or something like that in Ukraine. Well, gentlemen, if they don't have it, I have no option but to predict that the Third World War could be very much on the way. And I remember reading, the old Norse myths, which says, somewhere I read, that those whom the supernaturals wish to destroy, the gods, they first make them mad. So that's the only I can think of, how the Americans could be so foolish as to get involved in Ukraine. And they were even so foolish to get involved in Afghanistan. And now they are going to get involved in the conflict with Hamas. All these are omens, are portents that show that disaster is on the way for America. And I really have a lot of love for American life. I have visited America, and it's a wonderful place. But that's about all I can say, that the leadership is jingoistic. And all the time the Americans were trying to make friends with China and treat it as a friend, but the Chinese are going to give them a knockout blow, and they don't know what to do there. So America doesn't have any powerful ally on its side. They wanted India, but Modi is not going to play ball with them. The allies which they have are Japan and Great Britain, and now not to be called Great, but Little Britain. All of them, the allies are just useless as far as the military capability is concerned. And America is going to be single-handed, facing an army which is from China and Russia jointly, almost 4 million men. It's not going to be easy. The Americans don't have any strength like that, and that's the reason they would like to join India, ask India to get in on the bandwagon with them. Well, I know I'm not a crystal gazer, though sometimes I do amateur astrology. I want to tell you on that aspect now at this time. I'm very clear in my mind that these two hotspots in the world are going to blow up the world unless the Americans take the step. Basically, the Americans which are causing the war all around. And if the Americans decide and a new president comes in 2024, there could be something different happening. We'll have to wait and see, gentlemen. I think till that time the war will continue in both places, and whatever escalation will take place could take place only after the general election to the presidency in 24. And if Biden comes back, God save America, and there's a good chance that Trump, if he can get out all the legal cases which are against him, and he comes back, maybe things would be different and America would be able to breathe. I have nothing more to add, gentlemen. I think I've given you a political scenario. The war in Ukraine, a stalemate, but there's no choice but to accept the Russian terms in case you want a ceasefire. And in the Middle East, I'll discuss that later. I close now, gentlemen. Wish you all the best. Goodbye. Please subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends, come back for more. In the meantime, I will say Jai Hind and glory to India. Take care. I look forward to meeting you all again.